I needed a place to sleep. Then the ink chest told the truth.
Sua Part 1. The Exile and Hook. He was 24 and jobless. No wages, no room, no family willing to claim him, just an ink-stained apron and $7 he had kept folded behind his father's seed stamp. And with those $7, he bought a forgotten linen seed bag print room outside Decorah in Winneshiek County, Iowa, where county maps had stopped naming it in 1968. The north sill had split beneath the wall. Half the chimney leaned away from the roofline. The county had closed it on October 14, 2023, with demolition planned for the first thaw of spring. But beneath the block printing table sat an ink roller chest no one had opened in decades, holding money, a ledger, and the unfinished truth of who had kept whole farms alive. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Peter Ames had been aligning his whole life without knowing it. As a boy, he learned to place things by edges. Soup bowls square with the table seam. School papers parallel to the grain of his desk. Seed packets stacked so their printed faces looked forward. His mother called it fussing. His father, Daniel, called it care and let the boy keep doing it. Daniel Ames printed feed and seed sacks for small farms west of Decorah, first in a room behind a mill and later wherever someone would lend him a press. His hands carried a permanent blue-black crescent beneath each thumbnail. He spoke little after supper, but he kept every worn stamp wrapped in waxed cloth, as if it still belonged to working hands. On Saturdays, Peter went with him to Uncle Elias Ames, who was not truly an uncle but Daniel's mother's older cousin, a narrow man with silver hair combed straight back and a left index finger flattened by an old platen press. Elias taught seed bag block printing in a cedar-sided room that smelled of boiled linseed oil, iron, and dry cloth. Their ritual never changed. At 8, Elias warmed the ink near the stove. Peter laid washed linen on the table and pulled it square by the warp. At 9, they mixed lamp black with oil varnish until the palette knife lifted a ridge that held for 3 breaths. Then, Elias rolled the ink thin, pressed the carved maple block once, and made Peter wait before lifting it. Printing is not pressing hard, Elias told him. It is knowing when every surface has agreed. Peter carried that sentence for years. It meant pressure mattered less than attention, and that honest work left no part forced into place. Elias died in March of Peter's 17th year, after a winter cough settled low in his chest. By the time Daniel and Peter reached the print room, the landlord had cleared it. The maple blocks, roller handles, drying racks, and 3 ledgers were gone. Daniel found only 1 brass seed label stamp beneath the stove and gave it to Peter without speaking. 7 years later, Peter worked at Vetter Farm Supply under Lowell Vetter, a man who wore polished oxblood shoes, even in sleet, and kept the office blinds tilted so he could see the sales floor without being seen. Lowell corrected time cards in red pencil, locked the tool cabinets before closing, and spoke of loyalty whenever wages ran late. The old printing tools Daniel had once used were stored in the back building, though Peter was never given a key. The store closed on a gray Monday in September. Lowell taped a notice inside the glass door, then stood behind it while employees read that suppliers had seized the accounts. Peter's final payroll was missing. So were his work records. By noon, the apartment manager had learned the news. 3 days later, Peter's mother arrived carrying his father's old apron folded inside a paper grocery sack. She set it on the kitchen chair while the manager waited beside the door with a brass ring of keys. "You cannot stay here after noon tomorrow." 8 words, nothing more. Peter looked at his mother. She smoothed one corner of the grocery sack, then another. She did not offer her sofa. She did not say Lowell had cheated him, though she knew it. When Peter lifted the sack, the apron inside gave off the faint, bitter smell of old ink. His mother kept her eyes on the chair after he had gone. For 6 weeks, he moved east and north by buses that cost less than rooms. He slept 2 nights beneath the Cedar Rapids Depot stairwell, one behind a laundromat in Independence, where the dryer vents breathed warm air until midnight, and 4 in a church basement in Waterloo that closed each morning at 6. His money fell from $31 in coins and return deposits to 19, then 12. In Dubuque, he spent $3 on bread, peanut butter, and a paper cup of coffee he nursed until the library opened. By the time he reached Decorah, he had $8.11, the apron, the brass stamp, and a blister split beneath his right heel. The classified ad waited on the bottom row of a county disposal sheet, pinned beside the public library copier. Peter noticed it because the words print room had been typed in capitals. Abandoned commercial structure. Linen seed bag print room. As is. County lien transfer. $7. Buyer assumes hazards, taxes, and removal order. He read it twice, then carried the sheet to a window overlooking Water Street. The price felt less like mercy than a clerical mistake, but the address lay 12 miles away, and the sale closed at 4. Peter put $1 aside for food. He folded the advertisement around the brass stamp, tucked both into the apron pocket, and walked toward the county offices before he could give caution enough time to become surrender. By sunset, the $7 deed would be his, and the road beyond Decorah would lead him back to the last room his father had never stopped missing. Cow. Tra Loi. 2 Suo. Part 2. The Arrival. Peter left Decorah on foot with the deed inside his shirt and the county directions folded into the apron pocket. The clerk had marked 12 miles in blue pencil, though the route bent around hills and made nearly 15 before the print room. He walked 6 that afternoon, following Highway 9 east until traffic thinned, then turned onto a gravel road where the wind moved loose corn leaves along the ditch like dry paper. The temperature fell to 8 degrees after dark. A red hay barn stood beyond a sagging wire gate, its doors chained but its south lean-to open. Peter climbed beneath the roof, pressed himself between 2 square bales, and spread the ink-stained apron over his chest. Mice worked softly inside the wall. Once, near midnight, a truck slowed on the road, and its headlights passed through the boards in narrow white bars. Peter did not move until the engine was gone. At first light, he returned to Decorah because the deed still required the county seal. The town opened around him in measured sounds. Delivery crates outside Onyota Community Food Co-op, chairs being set upright at Mabe's Pizza, the brass revolving door of Hotel Winneshiek catching the pale sun, a baker carrying flour sacks into Magpie Coffee House, and the neon beer signs going dark above T-Box Sports Bar. Peter passed them with hay dust in his hair and $1 still folded in his sock. The Winneshiek County offices occupied a stone building whose corridors smelled of floor wax and wet wool. He found the recorder's counter beneath a clock that ran 2 minutes slow. Behind it sat a woman with a white scar crossing the first joint of her thumb. Her nameplate read, Mrs. Helen Knudsen, County Recorder. She examined the disposal form, then looked at Peter over the rims of square brown glasses. You understand? The structure is condemned. Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no certified water service. Yes, ma'am. You understand the lien includes unpaid property tax. Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition begins after the spring thaw. Peter placed 7 $1 bills on the counter. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Knudsen aligned the bills by their lower edges before counting them. She did not smile. She drew the deed from a gray folder, turned it toward him, and tapped 3 lines with the scarred thumb. Sign as buyer. Initial the hazard clause. Date it here. Peter signed Peter Daniel Ames. The pen dragged slightly on the last letter because his hand had begun to shake. Mrs. Knudsen placed the paper beneath a brass press with Winneshiek County engraved around its base. She pulled the handle. The seal entered the page with a dry, deliberate snap. Take East Water Street to Montgomery. Follow Locust Road north, past the old Creamery Lane. At the split, keep right toward Canoe Creek. You will see 2 black walnuts and a mailbox with no door. The building is behind them. She lifted the deed, then stopped before handing it across. Ames, she said. Peter waited. There was an Ames who printed grain sacks near there. My father did some printing. No, older than your father. She turned toward a row of bound transfer books and pulled down a volume whose leather spine had faded to brown-gray. Elias Ames. He leased the room from 1956 until 1989. County listed him as printer, caretaker, and emergency seed custodian. Peter looked at the open ledger. Elias's name appeared in black type, with additions written beside it in blue fountain pen. The final entry recorded the surrender of the lease after illness. He was my grandfather's cousin, Peter said. We called him Uncle Elias. Mrs. Knudsen studied his face more closely. The office clock clicked behind her. He came here every January, she said, paid in cash, and brought the clerks printed flour sacks for Christmas wrapping. My mother kept one. Blue cornflowers around the name. Peter touched the brass stamp through the apron pocket. The county notice did not mention him. County notices seldom mention who kept a place useful. She slid the deed toward him. Your $7 bought the walls. Whatever his work left there was not inventoried. The road north rose through bare fields, where harvested corn stood broken at the ankles. Peter walked past the abandoned Creamery Lane and turned toward Canoe Creek. The gravel narrowed between limestone banks, then opened beside a white farmhouse with green shutters. An elderly man in coveralls stood at the mailbox, holding back a red hound by its collar. You looking for the Ames room? Peter nodded. The man released the dog, which approached without barking and smelled Peter's trouser cuff. Name's Walter Blagan. Dog's June. He pointed with 2 fingers. Walnuts are ahead. Roof held through last winter. Cannot promise another. Did you know Elias? Walter rubbed the dog's ear once, knew his lamp, saw it burning late. He did not ask what Peter intended to do. He only opened the mailbox, found it empty, and walked back toward the farmhouse, with June following close behind. The 2 walnut trees appeared around the next bend, each broad enough that Peter could not have circled its trunk with both arms. Between them stood a rusted mailbox without a door. Beyond, 50 yards down a grass-covered track, the print room rested against the slope. It was larger than the classified notice had suggested, nearly 50 feet long and 22 wide, built of limestone to the windowsills and dark timber above. Weathered clapboards covered the gable ends. The roof had once been cedar shingle, though sheets of corrugated tin now patched the western half. The brick chimney leaned 3 inches north of True. Over the double doors hung a board sign whose remaining letters read Ames, Seed, and Sack. Printing, beneath several layers of flaking green paint. Peter stood at the track entrance until the wind pushed the apron against his knees. The brass key from the recorder's envelope did not fit the front lock. He tried twice, then noticed that the hasp had separated from the rotten jamb. One careful pull brought the door inward. Cold air moved out, carrying the odors of dried linseed oil, mouse nests, and ink that had settled into wood for half a century. Dust brightened in the doorway. Peter tasted iron where he had bitten his lip during the walk. The front room held the counter, a wall rack of maple blocks, and a cast iron stove shaped like a squat barrel. When Peter brushed the counter with his sleeve, the grain appeared dark and smooth beneath the dust. A faded sack front had been nailed to the wall. Red clover, northern grown, one corner chewed away. His boot sounded hollow near the center. Elsewhere the floor answered with close, tight creaks. He moved slowly, testing each board before giving it his weight. A narrow doorway led to the back workroom. Light entered through 4 windows clouded by grime. The block printing table stood beneath them, 12 feet long, its top stained in overlapping rectangles of red, blue, and black. Wooden rollers lay in an open rack. Linen sacks hung from ceiling hooks, stiff but dry, and when Peter touched one, the cloth rasped against his fingers like winter grass. Beneath the table sat a low oak chest, banded with iron. He crouched beside it, but did not open it. The room was losing light, and he had learned during the previous weeks not to investigate unfamiliar places after darkness made judgment uncertain. Instead, he found the well behind the building, drew water that smelled faintly of limestone, and washed his hands at the pump. The cold hurt his knuckles. He ate the last heel of bread beside the front window, while the sky turned the color of wood ash. That night he spread the apron over 2 folded linen sacks and lay on the front room floor near the unlit stove. The boards held the day's cold against his shoulder. Wind passed the chimney with a low bottle note, and something small crossed the back room, paused, then disappeared into the wall. Peter placed his father's brass stamp beneath his palm. Outside, Canoe Creek moved over stone in the darkness, steady enough to be heard through the closed doors. The room had been waiting for hands that still remembered. Xiaoyutra LOI 3 continuing Part 3 from the supplied script brief.da Dan Markdown. 1. Sua Part 3 The Discovery. For the first 3 days, Peter learned the property by necessity. The well needed 21 strokes before water rose clear enough to drink. The outhouse leaned toward the creek but still had a sound cedar seat and a door that latched with baling wire. Inside the print room, each floorboard possessed its own answer. The plank beside the stove clicked once. The center aisle groaned under a full step. Near the back wall, 2 boards gave a soft double complaint, warning him to place his weight closer to the joists. He marked unsafe places with scraps of linen. On the 4th morning, he walked into Decorah, carrying a list written on the blank side of the county notice. The hardware store stood on Eastwater Street, beneath a green awning faded almost gray. Inside, bins of nails lined one wall, and the air held the mingled smells of rope, machine oil, and the coffee warming behind the register. The owner, Russell Hovey, had 1 white eyebrow and 1 brown, which made every expression appear unfinished. He read Peter's list, then looked at the ink-stained apron. You living out at the old sack room? For now. Russell turned the paper over, although there was nothing on the back. You have an account anywhere? No, sir. You have work promised? No. Russell rested both hands on their counter. Then I cannot call it credit. Peter nodded and folded the list. I can call it an open account, Russell continued. Different ledger. I do not know when I can pay. That is why I said open. He pulled a thin book from beneath the register. The cover read, Farm and Home Repairs, 1948 edition. Its spine had been repaired with black cloth tape. Free, Russell said, because the chimney chapter is wrong in 2 places. I marked them. Peter bought only what his remaining money allowed. A wire chimney brush for $2.35, 12 feet of stove rope for 89 cents, a tin of furnace cement for $1.10, a used putty knife for 40 cents, and 2 pounds of 6-penny nails for 75 cents. Russell added a box of wooden matches without entering it in the ledger. Back at the print room, Peter opened the stove and found the firebox, packed with old walnut shells, a bird's nest, and flakes of rust. He carried the debris outside in a seed sack, then disconnected the stovepipe one section at a time. Black creosote fell from the elbows in brittle curls. The manual advised cleaning from the roof, but Russell had crossed out that paragraph and written, leaning stack. Work upward from cleanout. Tie brush. Peter fastened the wire brush to the stove rope with 2 constrictor knots. From the chimney cleanout, he pushed it upward 3 feet, drew it back, turned it a quarter turn, and repeated. Each pass released a dry shower into the bucket below. Where the brush caught, he did not force it. He twisted until the bristles cleared the mortar ledge, then advanced again. At noon, his shoulders began to burn. By 2, soot had entered the cuffs of his shirt and made black commas beneath his eyes. He worked for 6 hours, stopping only when the brush emerged into daylight above the chimney crown, and a clean circle of sky showed through the flue. The creosote filled almost half a grain bucket. He reseated the pipe with fresh stove rope, pressed furnace cement into the collar joint, and waited until the following afternoon before testing it. He began with 1 page of the county notice, 6 cedar splinters, and 2 pieces of dry walnut no thicker than his thumb. The flame drew inward. Smoke climbed the pipe without leaking at the seams. Peter held his hand near the collar, feeling for warm air, then added 1 larger split. The stove gave a low iron tick as it heated. He cooked oatmeal in a dented saucepan Russell had found beneath the hardware counter. There was no milk and little salt, but steam rose against Peter's face, and the first spoonful was hot enough to make him close his eyes. He ate seated on an overturned roller crate, while evening gathered at the windows. Afterward, he began the workroom inventory. He chose only objects that might still serve. 7 maple printing blocks rested in the wall rack, their carved faces bearing red clover, field corn, oats, and the names of seed houses long closed. A pair of composition rollers lay wrapped in waxed paper, their surfaces hardened but uncracked. Beneath the windows stood a cast iron ink slab veined with dried Prussian blue. 3 brass registration corners remained screwed to the printing table. A narrow drying rack folded out from the wall on wooden hinges. There was a thermometer marked for cloth curing, a bundle of linen sample strips, and Elias's old palette knife, with its walnut handle worn pale, where a thumb had rested. Peter held the knife beneath the window. Daniel had used one like it, balancing a ribbon of ink along the edge before laying it on the slab. Peter remembered watching from a flour barrel, while his father mixed black with a trace of red to soften it. Daniel had made him wait until the roller hissed evenly rather than slapped. The creak sounded beyond the wall. Peter returned the knife to the table. The oak chest beneath it was 30 inches long, 18 deep, and bound with 2 iron straps. Its lid opened without resistance. Inside lay 4 roller shafts in fitted grooves, 2 leather aprons, and a shallow tray stained violet at the corners. Peter lifted each piece, cleaned it with a dry cloth, and replaced it on the floor. The empty chest remained unusually heavy. He pressed one palm against the bottom and pushed. Nothing shifted. Using the handle of the palette knife, he tapped the interior from left to right. Most of the oak returned a dense, level knock. Near the rear corner, the sound changed. It was not hollow exactly, but lower, as though another thickness lay beneath the visible board. Peter measured the outside depth with a length of string, then measured the inside. The difference was nearly 4 inches. He ran the putty knife along the bottom seam. At the center, its blade struck something harder than oak. Scraping away a crust of dried ink, he uncovered a cedar disc no wider than a $half, fitted flush into the chest floor. 2 shallow holes had been bored into it. Peter bent a 6-penny nail into a narrow hook, inserted it into one hole, and turned. The disc rotated only a fraction. He added a second nail, one in each hole, and worked them together like a spanner. The cedar plug turned half a circle, a quiet release sounded beneath the board. Peter lifted the false bottom by its rear edge. Cold air rose from the compartment carrying the clean, resinous scent of cedar. Inside were 6 packages wrapped in oiled cloth, 1 narrow wooden case, and a square tin box whose lid had been tied with linen tape. He sat back on his heels. The stove ticked in the front room. Outside, a branch moved once against the siding. Peter removed the packages in the order they lay. He did not tear the cloth. He loosened each knot, flattened each wrapper, and placed it beside him. The wooden case held 3 carving tools, a narrow veiner, a skew chisel, and a small V-parting tool, all sharpened and rubbed with oil before storage. Elias's initials had been cut into their ash handles. A second bundle contained 2 brass registration gauges and a bone folder polished by years of use. The third held blocks of raw maple, dry and pale, each wrapped separately to prevent checking. Beneath them lay the tin box. Peter untied the tape and raised the lid. Currency filled the upper tray in bank straps, browned at the edges. The bills were arranged by denomination, not year, and a penciled total appeared on the underside of the lid. Beneath the tray were canvas rolls heavy with coins. He counted at the printing table. He made 1 column for bills and another for metal. He counted every stack twice, turning each strap after the first count. There were silver piece dollars, walking Liberty half dollars, Mercury dimes, and Indian head cents, worn smooth at the feathers. The rolls alone took more than an hour. At the bottom of the final roll, wrapped in a square of wool, lay a purple heart, engraved Daniel E. Ames, 1944. Peter did not touch the engraved face with his bare fingers. He held the medal by its ribbon and placed it beside his father's brass stamp. The total came to $38,760. He checked the penciled figure beneath the lid. It matched. Under the currency tray lay 2 remaining objects, a seed credit ledger bound in brown cloth, and a sealed envelope addressed in Elias's hand. The first page of the ledger listed farms, sack counts, seed varieties, and balances carried after crop failures. Some entries ended with paid, others ended with begin again. Peter placed the envelope on the table but did not open it. Night had settled against the windows. The money, tools, metal, and ledger seemed to alter the weight of the room, though nothing had moved except his hands. He returned the currency to the tin, wrapped the metal, and lowered the false bottom. The ledger and letter he carried outside. Canoe Creek ran high from rain farther north. Peter sat on the limestone bank with the unopened envelope resting across both palms. The water slipped around roots and pale stones, catching the moon in broken pieces. He watched until his hands stopped trembling and the cold entered through his boots. The room had been waiting for hands that still remembered. Kautra Loy Forso. Part 4. The Letter. At dawn, Peter carried the envelope back inside and set it beside the cold stove. The paper had yellowed around the edges, but the writing remained dark and narrow, each capital letter tilted slightly forward. He recognized the hand from old labels Elias had made for his father. Even before he broke the seal, he knew the letter had been written slowly. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then you have also found the chest, and the room has outlasted me. Dr. Miriam Feld, at St. Joseph's Hospital in La Crosse, told me in February that the cancer has entered my liver. She was kind enough not to disguise the time. I may have months. I may have less. I have therefore put these words where only a patient worker is likely to find them. Our family came to this trade in 4 generations. Samuel Ames, born in 1841 near Rutland, Vermont, brought his wife, Ruth, to Winneshiek County in 1869 and carved his first seed mark beside Canoe Creek. Their daughter Clara Ames, born here in 1878, took over the blocks after Samuel's hands stiffened. Clara's son Edwin, born in 1901, enlarged the room and printed for farms from Decorah to Kalmar. Edwin's nephew, Daniel Ames, born in 1923, learned beside him before the army carried Daniel to France. Daniel was killed near St. Lo in July 1944. I was his younger brother, Elias, and I kept the room after the telegram came. The trade closed on October 3, 1989. For more than 30 years afterward, this room stood silent, except when I came to oil the tools, turn the rollers, and make certain the roof still remembered its duty. I could not bear to sell what Daniel had worked beside, and I could not find anyone willing to learn without first asking what the work would earn. There are instructions you should know. For black sack ink, mix 4 parts boiled linseed varnish to 1 part lamp black by weight. Then add red oxide by the knife tip until the black warms. Roll it until the slab whispers evenly. Linen must be dry before printing. If it is taken damp, warm it near the stove for 20 minutes, but never above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Set the block at the lower left registration corner first, then lower the opposite edge without sliding. After printing, let the sack rest 12 hours before heat setting it for 4 minutes near 180 degrees. Too much heat yellows the cloth and makes a clean mark look careless. The money is not payment for finding the room. It came from printing done for farms that could not pay during the bad years. Some paid later. Some brought eggs, cordwood, or a day's labor. Some never returned because they had lost the farm or left Iowa. I kept what came back and recorded every sack in the ledger. You will see the words, "Begin again," beside certain names. Those families receive seed after flood, rust, drought, or foreclosure had taken the previous crop. A printed sack told the bank, the elevator, and sometimes the farmer himself that the seed inside still belonged to a future season. Inheritance is not possession. It is work received from tired hands and kept usable for hands not yet born. A sharp tool left dry, a straight mark on honest cloth, a debt forgiven before pride is broken. These are forms of inheritance too. Use the money carefully. Keep the tools working. Read the ledger before deciding what belongs to you. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elias Matthew. Ames, March 18, 1990. Peter read the letter twice. The second time, he paused over Daniel's name and the year 1944. His father had been named for a man Peter had never heard mentioned, a soldier whose medal had lain beneath the rollers, while another Daniel grew old, carrying the same name. Peter folded the letter along its original creases. The paper resisted at first, then settled into the lines Elias had made 36 years before. He opened the back door. The letter mentioned Samuel's first seed mark beside Canoe Creek. Peter followed the bank upstream, moving through dead nettles and flattened grass until he found a limestone post half buried beneath walnut leaves. Its top bore a shallow carving, 3 kernels enclosed by an oval, the same mark cut into the face of his father's brass stamp. Moss filled the lower grooves. Peter cleaned it away with the side of his thumb. He returned to the print room carrying 1 dry twig of red cedar. From the wooden case, he chose Elias's narrow veiner and rubbed a trace of machine oil along the steel. Then he lit the stove and held the blade near its warmth, not to use it, only to drive away the damp. The ash handle darkened beneath his palm. The room began to gather the kindnesses that had brought him there. Mrs. Knudsen had slowed the county machinery long enough to place Elias's name before him. Walter Blagan had pointed out the road without asking whether Peter deserved the building. Russell Hovey had created an open account where no credit existed and placed a repair manual in his hands. In Waterloo, an unnamed church volunteer had once left 2 boiled eggs beside Peter's folded coat before sunrise. None of them had solved his life. Each had simply made the next necessary action possible. Before the story moves forward, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they could not have known how badly you needed it. A meal, a ride, a tool, a sentence spoken without judgment. Tell us about that person in the comments, and let their name travel a little farther than it otherwise might. That night, Peter wrapped the 3 carving tools in Elias's oiled cloth and placed them beside his bed of folded sacks. The letter rested beneath his father's apron, protected from sparks and drafts. He slept with one hand near the wooden case, while the stove cooled into silence. Cow, Tara, LOI, 5, Sua, Part 5. The Slow Rebuild. The first snow came on December 2nd, 6 inches laid evenly across the roof, the walnut limbs, and the grass-grown track. Peter stood in the front room listening to meltwater strike the stovepipe, then read the roofing chapter in Russell's manual 3 times. The roof measured 50 feet by 24 along the slope. Allowing for overlap and waste, he calculated 12 squares of shingles, 4 rolls of felt, and 32 pounds of galvanized nails. Russell opened an account for the materials and brought out a roofing hatchet with a square pole and a handle darkened by another man's grip. "My brother carried this 30 years, he said. "Bring it back sharp." The following morning, Walter Blagan arrived wearing a wool cap with roofing tar hardened along its brim. Before farming, he had spent 27 years laying cedar and asphalt roofs across Winnesheek County. "I cannot pay you," Peter said. Walter set a bundle of shingles against the wall. "Good. Then we will not waste time discussing wages." They stripped the failed north section first. Beneath the shingles, one rafter had split from the ridge nearly to the plate. Walter showed Peter how to clamp a straight sister rafter against it, bore offset pilot holes, and draw the 2 pieces together with carriage bolts, rather than trusting nails and weakened grain. For 11 days they climbed before sunrise, when the frozen ground still held the ladder feet. Peter snapped each chalk line twice and laid shingles with a 5-inch exposure. Walter taught him to start every nail with 1 stroke, seat it with the second, and finish it flush with the third. On the 4th afternoon, Walter pointed with the roofing hatchet. "That nail's proud." Peter reached for the hammer. "Pull it." They worked without further speech until the ridge disappeared beneath the final cap course. Peter trimmed the felt clean at the eaves and flashed the chimney with salvaged copper tucked beneath the upper shingles. On December 16th, Walter climbed down, removed the ladder, and stood in the snow, while a hard wind crossed the new roof without lifting an edge. The chimney demanded slower work. Water had entered through the cracked crown, freezing and opening the outer faces of the bricks. Several had begun to spall, leaving red shells around soft centers. Mortar beneath them crumbled into powder when Peter touched it with the putty knife. He built a narrow scaffold from plank and sawhorses, then removed only 6 courses at a time, so the flue would not shift. Russell supplied reclaimed hard-fired brick and showed him how to mix 3 parts sharp sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, and 1 part fire clay for the joints nearest the flue. Peter kept the mortar stiff enough to cling beneath the trowel. The work lasted 3 weeks, most days beginning at 22 or 26 degrees Fahrenheit. Gloves made the joints clumsy, so he laid brick barehanded. Every 15 minutes his fingers went numb. He climbed down, warmed them around a mug near the stove, then returned before full feeling made the cold seem sharper. He reset the leaning upper courses around a plumb line, too little at a time for the correction to be visible from below. At the crown, he shaped the mortar to shed water outward and left a narrow expansion gap around the clay liner. On January 28th, Peter built a test fire with newspaper, cedar, and 2 splits of walnut. He watched from outside while smoke rose straight through the rebuilt stack, thin and blue against the winter sky. When he returned inside, the air remained clear. The draft drew cleanly enough to make the stove hum. By late January, thawed mud had begun entering through the doorway, and Peter turned to the floors. Most of the front room planks were white pine, nearly 14 inches wide, fixed with hand-cut rose-head nails. He drove each loose nail below the surface with a narrow punch, then rented Russell's random orbit sander for $14 a day. The machine pulled hard when it reached old ink, and Peter learned to move with the grain without lingering at the board ends. He made 3 passes, 80 grit to remove grime and raised fibers, 120 to level the scratches, then 220 by hand along the walls where the machine could not reach. Dust filled the window light and settled inside his sleeves. Each evening, he vacuumed the seams with Russell's borrowed shop cleaner and wiped the boards with mineral spirits. 3 coats of penetrating oil followed. Peter spread each coat thin with folded linen, waited 20 minutes, and removed every wet patch before it could turn sticky. Between coats, he kept the stove low and the doors closed. After the 3rd, he left the floor untouched for a 48-hour cure. The boards changed from dull, dark honey toward mahogany, though streaks of black and blue printing ink remained in the grain. Peter did not try to bleach them away. They belonged to the room's working surface as surely as the nail heads did. One morning, the sander would not start. Peter replaced the cord fuse, cleaned the switch, and tried it again. Nothing. He carried it to the doorway, then stopped. A great blue heron stood in the shallows of Canoe Creek, its long body motionless above the moving water. Peter sat on the back step and watched it hunt through patches of thin ice. The bird lifted 1 foot, waited, and lowered it without a sound. He did no work that day. The next morning, Russell exchanged the sander without comment, and Peter finished the final corner before noon. February brought the windows. There were 8 in all. 3 had no glass, 4 held cracked panes, and 1 retained its original wavy glass, dated 1788, in an old repair note, scratched inside the sash channel. That pane bent the view of the creek slightly at its center. Peter removed it first, wrapped it in 2 blankets, and stored it flat beneath the printing table. He repaired each sash on the bench. Rotten joints were opened, cleaned, and pinned with small oak dowels. After setting replacement glass into a thin bed of DAP 33 glazing putty, he pressed glazier's points every 8 inches and rolled the finishing putty between his palms until it formed an even rope. He laid it against the glass, then drew the putty knife in 1 uninterrupted stroke, keeping the bevel narrow enough that it would not show from inside. The sash weights had fallen in 4 windows. Peter opened the pockets, removed the broken cord, and replaced it with 1/4-inch braided cotton sash cord. He fed each line over the pulley, tied a figure 8 knot through the counterweight eye, and lowered the iron weight carefully into the wall. The preserved pane returned to the eastern window. Peter seated it last, using the softest putty and the least pressure his hands could manage. When the sash rose without binding, the old glass caught the room and creaked together, bending both into a single pale reflection. At the final western window, Peter was trimming the outer putty when a chickadee landed on the walnut branch beyond the glass. Its claws closed around the narrow twig. The bird tilted its black-capped head toward him, gave 1 small call, and remained there while he completed the line. Peter wiped the blade on his apron and lowered the sash into place. Cow, Tara, Lo-I. 6. Part 5. The Slow Rebuild. By late February, The walls had begun shedding their oldest repairs. Behind the stove, horsehair plaster clung to hand-split oak lath and broad islands, but 3 patches near the chimney failed as soon as Peter touched them. The first cracked around its edge, the second sagged overnight. The third slid down the wall before breakfast and broke across the floor like thin ice. Peter swept it up without cursing. Russell found an old paper bag of clean horsehair in the loft above his store. Peter mixed it into lime plaster until each handful held together without clumping. He dampened the lath, pressed on a scored scratch coat, and waited until it hardened enough to resist a thumb. The brown coat went on 3/8 of an inch thick and cured for 72 hours beneath damp linen. The final coat measured scarcely 1/8 of an inch. When the surface had begun to pale, Peter passed his float across it in slow circles. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Mullen began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. She owned the cafe near the courthouse and wore a pencil through the knot of her gray hair. The bags contained biscuits, soup in sealed jars, or 2 slices of pie, wrapped separately so the crust would not soften. Peter carried the empty jars back and tried to pay. Doris pushed his hand away with the pencil. In Candles, when the shop reopens, a week later, a 16-year-old named Caleb Nissen arrived on a red Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. His coat sleeves were too short, and a pale scar divided one eyebrow. Without waiting to be asked, he split the walnut round stacked beside the outhouse and built a covered woodpile against the south wall. Peter offered him $3. Caleb shook his head and tightened the maul head with a wooden wedge. My mother said, "About your grandfather." He rode away before Peter could explain that Elias had not been his grandfather, only a man the family had named close enough to become one. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on the creek road. He was tall, with one trouser cuff always caught above his boot. He never entered unless invited. He tipped his hat, looked toward the roof or chimney, and offered the same 4-word prayer: keep his hands steady. Peter did not know whether the Reverend meant his hands or Elias's. He accepted both. The cellar remained closed until February 11th. Its door lay beneath a trap in the back room, swollen tight by damp. Peter worked the hinges loose with oil, then lowered a lantern ahead of him. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot floor laid in rough fieldstone. The air smelled of mineral water and old apples. At the center rested a dressed granite slab, too regular to belong among the other stones. 3 carved kernels enclosed by an oval marked its surface. Peter brushed away the grit, but did not lift it. The slab was large enough to require a lever, and Elias's letter had taught him that not every sealed thing became his merely because he had found it. Under the 3rd step, his fingers met a small oak box wedged behind the riser. Inside lay a brass key. Its bow had been shaped into the family mark. 3 seed kernels held inside a narrow oval. Beneath it was a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the print room, before the Western edition had been built. She wore a white blouse, a dark skirt, and a printer's apron. In one hand, she held a maple seed block. Her face carried Peter's long nose, level mouth, and uneven brows. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words Clara Ames, daughter of Samuel, age 25, summer of 1903. Peter set the tintype on the mantel beside the Purple Heart. The key hung from a square nail beneath it. He tried it in the doors, chests, cupboards, and tool cabinets, but it opened nothing. It remained on the mantel. By March, snow retreated into the ditches and beneath the walnut roots. Canoe Creek grew loud with meltwater. Pale catkins lengthened on the branches, and the track softened until every trip to town left mud halfway up Peter's boots. He decided not to begin full seed sack printing that spring. The blocks needed cleaning. The rollers required new composition. and his hands had not yet earned the right to waste good linen. He chose one worn silver dime from the cash and exchanged it for lamp black, varnish, and small cloth remnants. On those pieces, he practiced ink thickness, pressure, alignment, and heat. Some marks came out faint. Others spread at the edges. He dated each failure and kept it. The house was patient. So was he. Part 6. The Epilogue. 2 winters later, on December 7th, 2024, Peter completed the first seed bag he was willing to hang from the drying rack. He had carved a new maple block from Clara's 1903 photograph, using the 3-kernel mark at its center and a border of narrow walnut leaves. The linen had been washed, dried, and warmed beside the stove. He mixed 4 parts varnish to 1 part lamp black, added a knife tip of red oxide, and rolled until the slab gave an even whisper. The block settled against the brass registration corners without sliding. Peter pressed once. When he lifted it, the mark stood exact and dark upon the cloth. No doubled edge, no unprinted hollow. After 12 hours, he heat-set the linen at 180 degrees for 4 minutes and let it cool flat beneath a clean board. He did not call anyone to see it. He simply hung the finished sack where morning light could reach it. The restored print room had changed without becoming new. Oil had deepened the pine floors. Lime plaster followed the small irregularities of the old lath. The 8 windows opened freely, and Clara's wavy pane still bent the creek into a silver curve. Maple blocks lined the wall rack, while the repaired rollers waited beneath linen covers. The ink stains remained on the long table. In January, a woodpecker loosened a strip of bark from the larger walnut tree. Beneath it, Peter noticed a dark brass corner. He climbed with a pruning ladder and found a narrow plate fitted into the trunk nearly 12 feet above the ground. The tree had grown around its edges, leaving only a keyhole and the faint outline of 3 carved kernels. The brass key from the cellar turned once. A copper-lined compartment opened within the trunk. Inside was a folded 48-star flag, protected by waxed canvas, and a note written by Clara Ames on November 11, 1918, the day the armistice ended the First World War. She had addressed it to the family member who might one day open the tree. She wrote that her younger brother Thomas had returned from France with lungs damaged by gas and hands that shook too badly to carve. He could still mix ink. He could still teach children to lower a block without sliding. Clara had folded the flag for him because war had taken enough without being allowed to take the usefulness of his remaining years. Her note ended with a request. Do not remember him only as a soldier. Remember what his hands did afterward. Peter carried the flag inside and laid it beside Daniel E. Ames's Purple Heart. The 2 men had served in different wars, one returning wounded and one not returning at all. Both had been preserved in objects smaller than the work they left behind. On July 14, 2025, the anniversary of Daniel's death near St. Lo, Peter took the Purple Heart to Phelps Cemetery in Decorah. Mrs. Knudsen had located the family stone beneath the name Ames, though Daniel's body remained in Normandy. Peter placed the medal in a small, weatherproof case at the marker and stood there, while a warm rain darkened the granite. There was no ceremony. Walter removed his cap. Reverend Boyd spoke no prayer. Peter read Daniel's name once, then closed the case. The money stayed mostly where Elias had placed it. Peter used 1 mercury dime for the first printing materials, a Walking Liberty $50 to replace the cracked stove grate, 1 Indian head cent toward the cotton sash cord, and 2 peace dollars. When the old well pump finally failed, 5 coins altogether. The remaining currency and metal went back into the tin box. Peter added a new inventory, the county deed number, and a note explaining every amount he had used. He wrapped the box in fresh oiled cloth and returned it beneath the false bottom of the roller chest. Across the top sheet, he wrote, "For the next one." The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris pinned a white index card to the cafe corkboard between a snowplow notice and an advertisement for piano lessons. Hand-printed seed and grain sack small order Ames print room, Canoe Creek Road. The first request came from a woman who saved bean seed on 12 acres near Kalmar. The second came from a family restoring an orchard outside Waukon. By sing, Peter kept a mailing list of 43 names in a school composition book. Though some ordered only 1 sack a year, he never printed faster than the ink allowed. Doris received 6 candle sacks with blue cornflowers. Russell received a tool roll, printed with his store name, and the date his open account had begun. Walter asked for nothing, so Peter made him a grain sack, bearing a red hound beneath 2 walnut branches. Caleb returned in June, carrying a plank wrapped in an old quilt. He had grown taller, though his coat sleeves remained short because he had not replaced it. He set the plank across the printing table and removed the quilt. The sign was carved from walnut, the letters cut deep and painted with warm black ink. Ames Seed and Sack, Printing, and Daughter Speeder ran his thumb along the final word. "There are no daughters," he said. Caleb leaned against the table, the pale scar in his eyebrow lifting. "Not yet." Peter looked toward Clara's tintype on the mantel. She had been Samuel's daughter, printer, keeper of the wartime flag, and the woman whose face had crossed 4 generations to arrive in his own. The old sign only said Ames, Peter said. That was the problem. Caleb had carved the words by hand, leaving slight tool marks in the background. Peter did not sand them away. Together they carried the sign outside and fixed it beneath the weathered original, using square-headed screws so it could be removed without damaging the old board. No daughters came that summer. None were promised. Still, the sign remained. In October, Peter took a clean sheet of ledger paper from the desk. He sharpened a pencil, tested it in the margin, and began a letter to whoever might someday find the roller chest. "My dear one, whoever you are." He wrote that the roof had been repaired in 11 days, that the wavy pane belonged to the eastern window, and that the floorboard near the stove still clicked once under a careful step. He recorded the ink formula, the names of those who had helped, and the location of Clara's flag. He did not tell the reader what choice to make with the room. Instead, he described how to test the ink with the edge of a palette knife, how to warm damp linen without scorching it, and how to listen for the change in a roller's sound when the coating had become even. Then he wrote that a trade survived only when a learner was permitted to make imperfect samples without being called careless. At the bottom, he left space for another hand. Winter entered early that year. Snow gathered along the limestone foundation and softened the track from the road. Peter closed the shutters on the western side, banked the stove, and checked the drying rack before turning down the lamp. The room had been waiting for hands that still remembered. Outside, the carved sign moved slightly in the north wind. The older board bore the remains of Elias's paint. Beneath it, the new walnut plank held the words Caleb had added for someone none of them yet knew. Peter placed his unfinished letter inside the cedar compartment, not with the money but beside the carving tools, where work would be found before wealth. Then he closed the chest. The linen seed bag print room waits. It has always waited. Back in the county recorder's office, Mrs. Knudsen kept one of Peter's $7 bills in the shallow drawer beneath her brass seal. She had replaced it with a bill of her own before the day's deposit was counted. The old dollar remained there, squared carefully against the wooden edge, while deeds changed hands, and the slow clock above the counter continued losing 2 minutes each day. Script complete. Total approximately 39,700 characters.